Hey everyone, it's me Jakov, and I'm back again with a new video for the channel, a new entry in the series Units of Total War Rise of Mordor, the faction being showcased today being Isengard. If you're new to the channel, in this series I look at a faction in the mod Rise of Mordor for the game Total War Attila, the mod linked in the description, going over the history of the faction within the books and films of Tolkien's universe, before looking at the real-life civilizations that inspired them. After that, I look at the units of the faction, discussing their battlefield role as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic the units are. Now that you know what this video will contain, let's start talking about Isengard. Isengard as a faction was one of the major players in the War of the Ring, helping to shape the events of the Lord of the Rings throughout its role as a fortress commanded by the turncoat wizard Saruman the White. However, before Isengard and its dark actions are discussed, the origins of the faction should first be looked at. Isengard, located at the bottleneck between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, was originally constructed during the Second Age of Middle-earth by the newly founded Kingdom of Gondor as a great fortress to defend its western borders, built with advanced Numenorean technology that for millennia would set it apart from most other buildings of man. As a fortress, Isengard was comprised of a massive circular wall of special stone surrounding a massive tower called Orthanc, which is one of the two towers that the films and books reference. The northern regions of Gondor had always been sparsely populated, but as millennia went by and Gondor began to wane, fewer people lived there until the Great Plague entirely depopulated the land, making Isengard redundant. Over time, that land was gifted to the ancestors of the Rohirrim by Gondor, and the Kingdom of Rohan was founded. While this happened, Isengard slowly transitioned from being under Gondorian control to falling under the influence of the Dunlandings, who upon taking control of the fortress used it to wage war against Rohan, with Rohan eventually winning the conflict. At the end of the fighting, Saruman the White would step up and offer his services as Warden of Isengard, a role he was promptly given. For a while Saruman was Warden until, as a sign of his growing darkness, he took the fortress for his own. As Saruman was corrupted and eventually turned against the free peoples of Middle-earth, and seemingly allied himself with the Dark Lord Sauron, Isengard too was corrupted, becoming a highly industrialized war center for Saruman's ambitions. By the outbreak of the War of the Ring, Isengard was a desolate place, covered in dark pits and caverns filled with orcs and evil men, with Saruman breeding Uruk-hai as a way of building an army. As part of Sauron's plans to defeat the free peoples of Middle-earth, Saruman and his forces were instructed to harass and weaken Rohan before conquering it, as a way of preventing it from assisting Gondor in the fight against the hordes of Mordor. Over the years, Saruman had used his magic to ensorcel Theoden, King of Rohan, as well as use spies and other agents to weaken the kingdom. While Isengard seemed ready to steamroll Rohan, with the assistance of the three hunters Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas, and Gandalf the White, the peoples of Rohan were able to rally against Isengard, defeating its armies at the Battle of the Hornburg/Helm's Deep, while the Ents, magical caretakers of the forest, captured Isengard and prevented it from continuing to partake in the War of the Ring. Following the end of the war, the fortress was handed over to the Ents, who destroyed its walls before turning the land into a forest. Now that we've looked at the history of Isengard from an in-universe perspective, let's look at its portrayal in the films as well as where the faction drew inspiration from. In the films, Isengard has much the same role as an evil faction for the protagonist to defeat. However, the portrayal of Isengard as well as some of its actions change between the mediums of book and film. While Isengard is shown as being transformed into an industrial hellscape in both the books and the films, in the books it's more of a gradual process, with it being revealed that the beautiful Isengard Gandalf sees before Saruman reveals himself as a traitor is nothing more than magic of Saruman designed to disguise his true intention, and that for many years he's been transforming it to suit his needs. In contrast, the film depicts Isengard as being beautiful until Saruman captures Gandalf, with him then transforming it under the orders of Sauron so as to make an army for the Dark Lord. In the films, Isengard's armies are shown as having some diversity. However, the overwhelming majority of its armies are Uruk-hai, especially the army that fights at the climactic Battle of Helm's Deep. Unlike in the books, where Uruk-hai did make up a significant amount of the army, there were also many orcs and Dunlandings in service to Isengard at the battle. In regards to the inspiration of Isengard, It's inspired by the Industrial Revolution and the impact that it had on nature, with Saruman literally destroying nature to feed the fires of industry. Nature, which gets revenge on industry for its wanton destruction of the natural world. The architecture of Isengard and Orthanc resembles that of Gondorian cities such as Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul, which makes sense given all were built by Gondorians. In terms of military inspiration, the armies of Isengard, the Uruk-hai, seem to be based on the proliferation of pike blocks in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, such as the Spanish tercios and Swiss pikemen. This makes sense given that Saruman is shown as being a master of innovation, pushing technology ahead, especially with his invention of gunpowder in the films, so it's logical that the armies commanded by such an individual would be representative of a later stage of medieval warfare compared to the other factions in Middle-earth. Now that we've looked at Isengard as a faction, let's now look at the units it brings to the battlefield. Starting off with the lone general unit the faction can field, we have the White Hand Stormers, an elite sword infantry unit made up of Uruk-hai. As I said earlier in the video, the bulk of Isengard's forces are Uruk-hai, so now is a good time to explain what they are. Uruk-hai, which translates to Orc folk, are a larger breed of Orc originally bred by Sauron over 500 years before the events of Lord of the Rings, with these troops being represented in Mordor's roster as the Uruks of Mordor. Unlike regular Orcs which don't like the sun and try to avoid it, and are physically smaller than men, Sauron's Uruks were larger and better able to resist the sun. After Saruman allied with Sauron, he was taught how to create Uruks by the Dark Lord. However, Saruman took that knowledge and perfected it, creating Uruk-hai. In the films, large orcs as tall as men, easily able to withstand the sun, using them as the core of his armies compared to the lesser troops used by other evil factions. The height difference between different species is actually quite prominent in the mod, and I may make a video showing that off in the future. With the Uruk-hai explained, let's return to the White Hand Stormers. In terms of appearances, the White Hand Stormers are seen in the Two Towers film, where they're the troops leading the battering ram to attack the gates of the Hornburg, which makes sense given their role is to capture fortifications for Saruman, and that the Hornburg was their first real test. In terms of armor, these troops are quite well equipped, with their helmets looking like a fusion of hoplite helmets, early Imperial Roman Gallic helmets, and Viking helmets. The metal crest reminds me of hoplite/Roman horsehair crests, or the neck guard at the rear of their helmets brings to mind Roman Gallic helmets, the intimidating facial portion looking like a beefier version of a stereotypical Viking helmet. The Roman look makes sense given the professionalism Saruman was going for with his army, the same thing being reflected in real life when kingdoms at the end of the Middle Ages looked to the Romans for inspiration on how to make their armies more professional. Overall, the helmets look good and fit the aesthetic of Isengard well, especially with the spikes added onto the helmets. The soldiers all have a mail shirt over which they have an articulated breastplate. An interesting thing to note is that none of the Uruk-hai have plate armor protecting their backs, which I believe is explained as Saruman trying to instill an aggressive spirit in them on the battlefield, kind of like you don't need much armor to protect your back because the enemy will never see you retreat, which can be psychologically empowering, but also works to make them stay in the fight out of fear of being killed in any potential retreat. In terms of historical accuracy, this is quite accurate, at least in terms of only having a breastplate for protection, not so much the psychological side of it. As plate armor developed, breastplates were used quite often, but it was only after breastplates to defend the front of the torso existed that fully encapsulating plate harnesses came into use. Even after plate harnesses protecting the front and back became common, many soldiers still used breastplates, sometimes for economic reasons of being unable to afford full plate armor, or as part of their duties on the battlefield, being troops who didn't need to be heavily armored to fulfill their roles, like lighter lancers compared to knights covered head to toe in plate. Either way, the look is still very historic for the Uruk-hai, and makes them infantry who are far more heavily equipped than most other troops in universe, especially the men of Rohan, whose technological level is maybe 400 to 500 years behind Isengard. In addition to their breastplates and mail shirts, they have armoured pauldrons with raised crests near the neck to deflect blows, which is historic. Covering their forearms are metal vambraces as well as steel gloves, which are historic except for the spiked knuckles, which, while not historic, are effective tools for battle. Protecting the crotch is an iron plate, reminiscent of a codpiece, while the thighs are left undefended. with greaves protecting the shins, something also done historically by hoplites. Turning away from their armour, the White Hand Stormers have large hacking blades which I would best categorise as falchions, with a back spike useful for piercing armour or dragging riders off of their horses. Other soldiers in the unit also have blades which are reminiscent of Dacian falxes, with forward curving blades that combine the hitting power of an axe with the usefulness of a sword, kind of like an upsized version of a kopis sword. As for the shields, the unit uses large shields with spikes to form defensive formations akin to the Roman testudo when attacking fortifications to defend against enemy projectiles, which is highly accurate compared to going into testudo on the open battlefield, which is less so. The shields remind me of the Roman scutum with a more brutalist take, reflecting the dark heritage of the units using it, with the white hand of Saruman emblazoned on them as a way of showing their loyalty to the creator. Now that we've looked at the equipment of the unit, let's find their commanding officer and compare him to his troops. The commanding officer is equipped much the same as his troops, the only difference being that he has no shield and that his helmet has the white hand of Saruman on it, indicating his status, much like his standard bearer next to him. Looking at the unit, I consider it one of the best general units we've looked at so far in the series, given it combines the defensiveness of shields against enemy archer file in prolonged combat with the efficiency of swordsmen in killing enemies. While not capable of launching cavalry charges, the unit can withstand immense punishment and when attacking enemy forces from the rear can inflict horrific damage, making it quite the unit. I believe there are restrictions about how many you can bring to the battlefield, but as an elite unit, it can be the deciding factor in a battle. I definitely love the unit and recommend trying to incorporate them into any Isengard army if possible. Moving on from the White Hand Stormers, we'll go to the first sword infantry unit the faction can field, and it is quite a step down, the Mordor Rabble. These troops are among the lightest soldiers available to Isengard, and it shows, with them having no quality to speak of except for their numbers. These troops are the orcs sent to assist Saruman in building his armies by Sauron, and as such are very much outliers when it comes to the Isengard roster, and I believe they are just literal Orc Rabble, a unit commonly shared by other evil factions. Looking at what equipment they have, some of them have metal skull caps while others have helmets reminiscent of those wielded by Vikings. However, many of the orcs in the unit completely lack helmets. In terms of body armor, they almost completely lack it, with a few having scraps of mail here and there. In terms of weapons, some have axes that wouldn't look out of place in the hands of a militia from the Middle Ages, while others have short swords, daggers, and falchions, reflecting their lower status as soldiers. Combined with these assorted weapons are small wooden bucklers, either completely circular or with cutouts, such small shields being in the hands of low-class troops being very historically accurate. One thing to note about these orcs is that the mod reflects the fact that their species is smaller than humans, so when seen alongside human units, you see how small they really are, and by extension how small their weapons and shields really are. In terms of an officer, I think this orc with a male shirt on is the closest they have, and his shirt helps him stand out from the rest of the rabble, as does the iron gorget around his neck, to protect it from enemy blows. As an officer, he's poorly equipped, yet compared to the solid troops he leads, he's head and shoulders above them in terms of armour. As for the role of the Mordor Rabble, it really only exists to be used as fodder against enemy projectiles, its only quality being in the large numbers the unit has. Even so, the unit will break very easily. When building early armies, the Mordor Rabble is useful in filling out numbers, but the unit should be abandoned the moment you can afford to replace them with other troops, given that even when fighting against Tier 1 enemy militia units they tend to lose. The crappy quality of the Mordor Orc Rabble becomes even more noticeable when you realise that Isengard can only have 3 of them in an army, meaning that the most useful thing about Orc units, their overwhelming numbers, is unavailable to the faction, making them have that much less value. Luckily for Isengard, these are just the first swordsmen it has in its roster, with the others being far better. The next step up from the Mordor Rabble are the Uruk-hai Raiders, who were seen in the Lord of the Rings films fighting the Fellowship of the Ring at Amon Hen, with their leader Lurtz being the one to kill Boromir. During the Two Towers, you see them operating alongside the Dunland Raiders in Saruman's service, attacking the settlements in Rohan. Looking at their armour, it's not very historical overall. Their leather helmets being reinforced with metal plates is somewhat historical as an idea, rather than as a design, with metal plates being added to leather armor, like helmets, to assist with its protective capabilities. However, having armored breastplates and the rest of your body being protected with leather isn't historical, especially when you take into consideration that troops using leather generally didn't have any metal armor at all. I understand that the limited metal and mostly leather look is meant to belie their role as fast raiders. However, gambeson, textile armor, would have been a far more historically accurate look, especially if the troops had no metal armor at all. However, that may have reduced the unique look of the troops compared to other factions, so I understand why they went with this look. Apart from their leather skirts, shoulder armor, and van braces, the only other bit of armor that these troops have are their metal sabatons, their iron plates over leather boots protecting their feet. All the troops are equipped with the standard Uruk-hai blade, which is a cross between a machete, a falchion, and a spike. Their hilts don't have guards, which is historic. There are many swords which didn't have guards. As for their shields, it's a far smaller version of the one used by the White Hand Stormers, and it is uniform equipment for the Uruk-hai, Isengard being much like Gondor in that its armies do have some standardization, with the body armor, shields, and swords of Uruk-hai generally being shared, so when they appear in other units, I won't go into detail on them. Going back to the shields, they have the role of a heater shield, with sharp spikes on the end to make even the defensive equipment of Isengard capable of harming enemies. The heater shield comparison makes sense, especially when you realize the troops of Isengard tend to be well armored, much the same as the armored troops who used heater shields in real life. The Raiders officer stands out from his soldiers, wearing a complete articulated breastplate over a mail shirt, his arms being covered in the same pauldrons and van braces as the White Hand Stormers. His legs are similarly unarmored apart from his greaves and sabatons. As for his helmet, it's the same kind of helmet as those worn by the White-Handed Stormers with its crest, and is similarly used by other Uruk-hai officers, with the white hand of Saruman on it to show off his status. He bears no shield and has the same sword as his men. As a unit, the Uruk-hai Raiders are very useful, being far more valuable than the Mordor Rabble, easily being a match for equivalent units fielded by other factions. While Isengard does have better units, these guys will always make for a good addition to Saruman's army and will be the core of early armies, becoming useful support units once they're superseded. The true heart, however, of Isengard's sword units is the next unit in the roster, the Uruk-hai Infantry. Just looking at them, you can tell these are very heavy professional troops, who in the films make up a crucial part of Isengard's army, fighting most ferociously in the Battle of Helm's Deep. Their armor is the same as that of the White Hand Stormers, except maybe a bit simpler. They bear the same shields and swords as the Uruk-hai Raiders, proof of the faction's standardization of equipment, which makes them superior to the vast majority of Orc units. Their commanding officer is equipped much the same as his men, except with no shield, so I won't go into detail on him. As a unit, the Uruk-hai Infantry should be the core of Isengard's army, with the troops being highly effective in melee combat and being able to withstand enemy projectiles quite easily due to their armor and shields. The troops are quite versatile and can operate as offensive and defensive troops on the open battlefield and in sieges. While in terms of quality they're not the best Isengard has to offer, with the White Hand Stormers being a cut above them, realistically, an army comprised of Uruk-hai Infantry is superior to a handful of White Hand Stormers. Definitely a unit that should be used to maximum effect if victory as Isengard is something that you wish. That said, Isengard doesn't just have sword infantry in its army, for it also has a robust line of shock troops, starting with the Half-orc Axemen. You see these guys in the Fellowship of the Ring film at the Battle of Amon Hen, fighting alongside the Uruk-hai Raiders against the Fellowship of the Ring. As for them being half-orcs, Saruman in the books and films is described as attempting to cross different species to try and combine their best aspects, with half-orcs being amongst his earlier experiments, his efforts culminating in his highly successful Uruk-hai. Reflecting their status as prototypes, these troops aren't as effective as the Uruk-hai, but nonetheless are good units. I'm not going to go into their armor because it's the same as the Uruk-hai Raiders, the only difference between the two being their equipment. These guys not having the standard Uruk-hai shield and sword, and instead wielding bardishas, large two-handed polearms, which makes sense given they're a shock unit, using these large weapons to break apart enemy units. Their officer is yet another standard Uruk-hai officer, so I won't talk more about him. As a unit, these troops are pretty good, being effective in their role, Against enemy units, they can cause a lot of damage, especially in attacks on enemy rears where they'll shred the enemy. However, like most shock units, these guys are highly vulnerable to charging enemy cavalry and can't withstand enemy ranged units due to their relative lack of armor and missing shields. As a unit, they should be used to enhance your army rather than be the core of it. However, there will always be a place for them in Isengard's armies. Moving on from them, we have the epitome of Isengard's shock troops, the Berserkers. These troops are first seen in the Battle of Helm's Deep, being the first up the ladders to attack the men of Rohan and the elves of Lothlorien, proving themselves to be highly dangerous opponents. Looking at their armor, they barely have any, with only their right arms being covered in van braces, and their lower legs and feet being protected by greaves and sabatons. These troops truly are berserkers and go into battle without any fear of death, expecting to die and hoping to kill as many of their enemies as possible. In terms of historical accuracy, the northern civilizations which spawned Vikings supposedly had berserkers who before battle would go into a wild state, with some claiming it to be due to those warriors partaking in narcotics. The key word to take out of what I just said was supposedly, because there is very little in the way of verifiable proof that such troops existed outside of legend. Even if berserkers as they are depicted in the stories existed, whole units of them are highly unlikely. In the Lord of the Rings films, the Uruk-hai Berserkers are fanatical shock troops of Saruman who will give their lives without a second thought to achieve his goals. Apart from their limited armor, the troops also have highly protective helmets which remind me of Corinthian helmets crossed with some gladiatorial helmets, such as those used by the Hoplomachus and the Krupalari. According to some additional material, the Berserkers fill their helmets with blood before entering battle so as to cover themselves with gore and to hide in their bloodlust. Looking at their swords, they wield massive two-handed blades, which remind me of Zweihanders, the massive two-handed swords used during the 16th century, most famously by the German Landsknecht mercenaries. The wicked prongs at the end of the blade look quite similar to some African blades, so the design of the blade and its measurements are quite historically authentic, although as far as I know, this particular combination of features never occurred. As a weapon, this sword is closer to a polearm than a sword really, with the massive spikes at the end of it easily being capable of piercing armor. Looking at their officer, he's equipped much the same as the rest of his troops, the only difference being that he has pauldrons to protect both of his arms as well as van braces, something that none of his troops have. As a unit, these troops are fantastic shock troops on the attack, being capable of decimating unit after unit, especially in flanking and rear attacks. However, because they lack armor to such a degree, enemy cavalry and ranged units will have no problem destroying the unit if it's deployed unwisely. While they do possess greater quality than the Half-orc Axes, because only a limited amount of these guys can be in an army, Half-orc Axes should be used to support them or to just replace them entirely, unless only a really limited group of shock troops is what you're going for. Overall, a good unit with some highly noticeable downsides. We'll now go from a highly effective unit to the opposite with the Dunland Tribesmen, a unit shared with the Dunland roster. These are, as the name suggests, tribesmen from Dunland, a native population in Middle-earth that resents the men of the West from driving them from their territories, with the Dunlendings having often fought against the men of Rohan. In the extended cut of the films, these tribesmen fight alongside the Uruk-hai and Orcs of Isengard in burning the Westfold, while in the books they make up a large portion of Saruman's armies, fighting prominently at the Battle of Helm's Deep, something that is entirely omitted from the film version of the battle in place of a whole army of Uruk-hai. Looking at these warriors' equipment, they entirely lack helmets and body armor, with the exception of their sheepskin tunics and their leather cuffs on their arms, which are not historic. Some of them do have shreds of mail here and there, however at that point they may as well be unarmored. Them lacking helmets is logical though, as they do also entirely lack armor. The tribesmen have round wooden shields which are historic, as well as axes, hatchets, and cleavers, which speaks to their lack of quality as a unit. Their commanding officer is somewhat better equipped, having a helmet which may as well be a stereotypical Viking helmet with the rings around the eyes, covered with a wolfskin, which was done historically by the Romans with troops such as the Welite skirmishers. On his right shoulder is a pauldron of Uruk-hai armor, showing the alliance between the Dunlendings and Isengard. His chest is entirely protected, much like the Celtic warriors who fought the Romans millennia ago. However, dressed like that, he's less armored than his ill-equipped troops, which is highly unlikely in ahistorical. His upper legs are protected by folds, which is nice to see, and he has boots on his feet. In his right hand he bears a falchion that wouldn't be out of place in a historical collection, and his shield is round and covered in bronze scales, which isn't that historical as far as I know. Bronze shields were historical, but not in that pattern. As a unit, these troops have much to be desired, but given they are an axe unit, they do have some limited shot capabilities, and their shields do give them some measure of defense. Much like the Mordor Rabble, these guys aren't good for much except soaking up projectiles, and can do some damage in melee, more so when attacking from the rear. Also like the Mordor Rabble, these units will never be the core of an Isengard army, for only 3 can be in an army, making them a support unit at best, and one that is easily outperformed by the Uruk-hai Raiders or Half-orc Axemen. The best use for this unit is in the early stages of building an army, but they should quickly be phased out once better troops become available. With this unit's role now discussed, we'll move on to the lone pike unit that Isengard fields, the Uruk-hai Pikes. These troops are highly prominent in the films, being the core of Isengard's army, designed to counter the strength of Rohan by implementing pike blocks to butcher their cavalry. These soldiers fight at the Battle of Helm's Deep, operating as a strategic reserve to defend the rear of the army from any cavalry attacks, or the Uruk-hai Infantry storms the fortress. It's for this reason that I said before that Uruk-hai Infantry should be the bulk of your army, as they are more versatile than pikemen, which is somewhat historically accurate. As noted before, Saruman's implementation of a pike army, one step above the other armies of Middle-earth, is much like the switch to pike armies at the end of the Middle Ages, which took inspiration from armies of antiquity. Pikemen throughout history varied in terms of versatility, with some operating purely as pikes, such as the Scottish levied troops, and others such as Alexander's pikemen doubling as infantry capable of storming enemy citadels, something this unit can't quite do. Looking at their armour, it's mostly identical to the standard Uruk-hai armour, the only difference being the spiked cestus covering their left hands in place of a shield, such a glove being used by gladiators in real life. The pikeman's left glove has an enlarged vambrace, which is practically a small shield, which while not quite historically accurate is historically inspired, given that when pikemen used shields, they were typically far smaller than shields wielded by spearmen. Looking at the pike itself, it, like most other pikes depicted in the Lord of the Rings films and by extension this mod, is historically inaccurate. The pike length is accurate, however the head shares the same issue as other pike units, in which the head is closer to a blade than a small spike, and is way too long for a pike to be used feasibly. When using pikes, the tip should be as small and light as possible to reduce weight and prevent imbalancing on the end of the large lever that the shaft becomes. While Uruk-hai are very strong, it's not the strength of the pike wielder that's the issue, it's the strength of the wooden shaft that is imperiled by having such a massive weight on the end. It does make the pikes look crueler and means slashing is somewhat possible, but slashing when using a pike defeats the purpose of the weapon. The small hook on the end is similar to that seen on a sword and polearms, and on these pikes is just meant to be another feature designed to put horsemen at a disadvantage by hooking them off of their horses. Looking at their commanding officer, he looks much the same as his men, except that he wields a standard Uruk-hai sword rather than a pike. Looking at the unit's role, this is the only pike unit that the faction can field, and it is quite the unit. It outclasses other pike units fielded by other factions such as the Gondorian White Tree Pikes, who because they're elite means only a few can be in a Gondorian army, whereas this unit may possess somewhat lower quality, but can be used en masse, which makes them far more useful in practical terms. These warriors are equally good at holding the line against enemy infantry and cavalry, and will inflict grievous casualties so long as they aren't outflanked or made to suffer prolonged attacks from enemy ranged units. For as good as their armour is, they still lack shields and arrows will kill them. One thing to note about Isengard is that because it lacks spear units entirely, the Uruk-hai Pikes fulfill 2 roles, both of which they do pretty well. While the unit does have its weakness, it should still be a core component of any Isengard army. Having looked at the Pikes, we've covered all the melee troops Isengard can field, so we'll move on to its ranged units, starting with the Mordor Bow Rabble, another unit which is shared among several evil factions. These troops are equipped practically the same as the Mordor Rabble, except that they lack shields and any melee weapons, with the exception of daggers, instead using small recurve bows more akin to hunting bows than anything else. As a unit, these archers are incredibly weak, having bad accuracy and being unable to do much in the way of damage with their ammunition, especially against armoured enemies. In archery duels, these orcs stand no chance against enemy units of substance, and will lose just about every time. The only thing the unit has going for it being the number of troops it has, meaning it can send a lot of ammunition towards enemy lines. If engaged in melee, the unit stands no chance, meaning that once they run out of ammunition, they lose just about all of what little value they have. This unit should be used only to give Isengard some range capability, but the moment better archers become available, they should be used instead. Speaking of those better archers, here they are, the Uruk-hai Archers. These troops are akin to the Uruk-hai Raiders and Half-orc Axemen in terms of armor, instead of wielding large recurve bows. While recurve bows are most definitely historically accurate, attaching metal blades to them is not, and is far more fantastical. For use in melee, the archers all have machetes or falchions smaller than the standard Uruk-hai blade. Their officer is a standard Uruk-hai officer, so nothing new there. In terms of their role, these troops make up the core of Isengard's archers, replacing the Mordor Bow Rabble and giving the faction greater range capabilities. While they aren't great archers in comparison to those fielded by other factions, they do their job adequately. They can't withstand enemy fire due to their relative lack of armor, but they can fight in melee somewhat, doing better as a flanking force than they would as frontline infantry once they've expended all their arrows. While not the best unit in the world, Isengard isn't an archer civilization, and the relative mediocrity of this unit showcases it. With that said, it is very useful in giving Isengard the ability to fight its enemy at range. Moving on from the Uruk-hai Archers, Isengard has something in its roster that is quite unique, being shared only with Erebor, that being crossbows. The Uruk-hai Crossbows are the epitome of Isengard's range units. However, first we'll look at their armor. In terms of armor, the Uruk-hai Crossbows are equipped much the same as the other Uruk-hai, the only difference being that their helmets are somewhat lighter than those used by the others, which makes sense, given these soldiers aren't meant to be frontline warriors like the other Uruk-hai. Their helmets very much look like a medieval sallet, with some having a flat bar extending above the nose to protect against downward strikes. Each soldier uses a crossbow, a weapon that is never mentioned in Tolkien's writing, but was instead created for the films to show Isengard's technological superiority. While the crossbows look brutal with the spiky aesthetic, it still looks functional. In terms of melee weapons, the crossbowmen share the same weapons as the Uruk-hai Archers. Their officer is yet another standard Uruk-hai officer. As a unit, the crossbows give Isengard unique capabilities, however, they don't completely replace Uruk-hai Archers and instead complement them. While the quality of the crossbows is greater than that of the archers, they do have drawbacks. They can only shoot straight, meaning certain angles that they may find themselves in makes them useless, such as shooting up at enemies on walls. Likewise, they can't shoot over the heads of their allies or over walls anywhere close to the way archers can. However, with their armor, the unit can handle exchanges with enemy ranged units far better than any other ranged unit Isengard can field. Compressed into melee combat, these troops aren't as good as the other ranged units serving as swordsmen, such as say the Gondorian line archers, but these troops can do a fair bit of damage in melee, especially when attacking from the rear. Overall, the crossbows are a good unit that helps round out Isengard forces that little bit more. With the crossbows examined, all of Isengard's ranged units have been looked at. However, Isengard does have a special unit that is quite unique in comparison to other rosters, that being the White Hand Sappers. I won't go over their equipment because they're berserkers, this time however with bombs strapped to their backs, bearing torches. This suicidal unit represents Saruman's efforts to industrialize and push forward technology, his armies being the only one in the mod to use gunpowder in any way. These troops exist only to blow holes in walls and are quite effective in doing so. However, they're very situational and should only ever be considered when besieging an enemy settlement. Moving on from the Sappers, we turn to Isengard's only cavalry unit so far, the Dunland Horse Raiders. Raiders mounted upon horses to make them that much more effective. These guys are very light skirmisher cavalry, and it shows, with unarmoured horses and mostly unarmoured riders. In terms of equipment, the riders have just as little as the Dunland Tribesmen. However, some wear leather Uruk-hai helmets, and others wear nasal helms that wouldn't look out of place in a Norman army. All the riders have the same wooden shields and use javelins that look quite historic, with a bit of a leaf-shaped spear tip. Their commanding officer is equipped much the same as the Dunland Tribesman officer, with his wolfskin pelt and general lack of armour. As a unit, these raiders give Isengard extremely limited cavalry capabilities, not even holding a candle to cavalry wielded by factions which aren't cavalry-oriented, like Gondor, let alone a cavalry civilization like Rohan. These horsemen can harass enemy forces somewhat and can charge enemy rears, but really are useless compared to other cavalry units. Overall, not a very useful unit, perhaps only having a place in early builds of Isengard's army, considering cavalry was never meant to be a core strength of the faction. Moving on from the Dunland Horse Raiders, we have Onagers, the crews of which are completely unarmoured except for greaves. Much like every other faction's Onagers, these give Isengard siege capabilities. However, unlike other factions that solely have Onagers, Isengard's White Hand Sappers means this advantage of Onagers isn't as useful for Isengard as it is for other factions. Overall, it's a mediocre unit that helps strengthen Isengard, but isn't that game-changing at the end of the day. Looking at Isengard overall, it's a faction that heavily relies on pinning down enemy forces with its heavy infantry and quickly demolishing them, sacrificing the maneuverability that cavalry provides by adopting such a strategy, especially given its current roster. Wargs may be added in the future, but for now the faction is quite immobile, much like the dwarves who also rely on heavy infantry to pin down enemies and defeat them. Isengard is definitely a faction that I like and that I find to be quite balanced. It's not my favourite faction, but it's one that I would happily use any day. Having said all that, I hope that you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please make sure to like and subscribe. More videos on other factions will be coming out soon. This is your host Jakov, signing out.